12 most terrifying medieval royal wedding traditions ever recorded. It was never a matter of individual deviance, it was simply the law of the era. Behind the gilded, magnificent castle doors, their sacred wedding rituals were, in reality, nothing more than cold, calculated transactions. There was virtually no room for romance or personal privacy, as human bodies and entire lives were weaponized as collateral to secure colossal political alliances. Let us pull back the velvet curtain and unveil the 11 most haunting marital customs of the feudal era. By the time we reach the final rituals, you will realize a deeply ironic historical truth. The very methods our ancestors used to brutally enforce and tighten their grip on power ultimately became the executioner's axe that severed their own dynasties. Number 12. Intentional inbreeding to hoard power. To open this dark chronicle, we must look directly at the most macabre manifestation of the greed for power. If you have ever wandered the grand halls of European museums, observing the succession of royal portraits across generations, you will undoubtedly notice a bizarre, unsettling distortion. With each passing generation, their faces lose their natural form, the lower jaw protrudes grotesquely, the lips droop heavily, the eyes grow vacant and listless. This was not a flaw in the painter's brush. It was the direct, visceral consequence of the most ruthless strategy for power preservation in human history. To avoid sharing lands, noble titles, and gold mines with outsiders, many royal houses chose to permanently seal their doors. They commanded their own flesh and blood to cross-marry. First cousins wedded first cousins, uncles took their nieces as brides. The illustrious House of Habsburg in Europe stands as the most glaring, tragic testament to this twisted choice. Look back at the medical records of Charles II of Spain. His life was an endless, agonizing battle with disease. His jawbone was so severely deformed that he could barely chew his own food. He walked with a crippling frailty and was utterly bereft of the ability to produce an heir. The root cause? His family tree was not a tree at all, but a tangled, collapsing web, overlapping upon itself through generations of relentless inbreeding from his grandparents and great-grandparents. The patriarchs of these dynasties were, for the most part, entirely aware of these horrific consequences. They saw the sickly children, the skyrocketing infant mortality rates, and the undeniable intellectual decay of their successors. Yet, the clinking of gold coins and the paralyzing fear of losing control drowned out all reason. The tradition of bloodline marriages persisted, dragging on from one century to the next, ultimately serving as the very poison that rotted their dynasties from the inside out. Turning a blind eye to the deformities of their own children was the price they willingly paid to keep the throne. But for the brides forced into this political chessboard, the cruelty did not wait for the next generation to reveal itself. It struck long before the wedding bells even chimed, beginning with a brutal stripping of their dignity in the most raw and humiliating manner imaginable. Number 11. Public virginity examinations before the court. Let us delve into the first chilling custom. The concept of privacy was practically non-existent within the royal protocols of this era. Picture a day in the mid-14th century. A cumbersome procession of carriages transports a 15-year-old princess from a minor fiefdom, surviving a grueling, month-long journey to reach the capital of the towering empire. The young girl steps down from the carriage, her legs still trembling from the exhaustion of the road. But she is rarely granted the mercy of a bed to rest in. Instead, She is immediately escorted by unfamiliar royal guards and strange ladies-in-waiting, led down long, echoing corridors into an isolated chamber deep within the bowels of the fortress. Virtually no family member or trusted servant from her homeland is permitted to cross the threshold with her. Inside, waiting in the cold shadows, are high-ranking female court officials and hardened royal midwives appointed by the reigning dynasty. They approach. Layer by heavy layer, the young girl's garments are stripped away. A clinical, invasive physical examination begins. Their objective is violently clear and utterly devoid of warmth, to confirm that the future bride possesses a standard physique, harbors no hidden plagues, and above all, to find undeniable anatomical proof that she has never been with another man. The midwives scrutinize every physical detail, whispering, calculating, and judging right in front of the trembling girl. Empathy or soothing words are a rarity. The procedure operates with the mechanical coldness of a livestock appraisal before finalizing a high-stakes trade agreement. The scratching of quill on parchment fills the quiet room. Every intimate detail of this inspection is documented. In some courts, these findings were rarely kept secret. Historical records indicate that the results could be openly presented to the highest-ranking lords of the groom's family. The bride's life, her honor, and the vast majority of her family's political leverage hung by a thread over those ink-stained words. If everything aligned with the contract, the marital machinery ground forward. But what if the report noted an anomaly? What if she failed to meet their ruthless standards? The betrothal was in immediate danger of being shattered. The bride's family would be crushed under catastrophic financial penalties for deception. While the severity varied by era, in extreme cases, the bride could be subjected to draconian punishments, permanently stripped of her royal status, and exiled with no hope of ever returning home. Their fates were sealed by circumstances they had almost zero chance to defend themselves against. Surviving that humiliating trial to officially wed was only the prelude. You might assume that once the grand ceremonies concluded and the bedroom doors shut, the newlyweds would finally find peace. You would be dead wrong. What waited for them in the dark of their wedding night was a deeply traumatic, invasive ordeal. Number 10. The wedding night witnessed by state officials. Having survived the physical inspection, the couple endures a marathon of festivities lasting from the crack of dawn until the dead of night. The banquet ends. The lords and ladies rise. You would think this is the moment the exhausted newlyweds are finally escorted to their chambers to rest. But in many feudal courts, the true nightmare was just beginning. Step back in time to an evening in 15th century England or Spain. As the lutes and drums fade, a massive throng of nobles, high-ranking ministers, and servants forms a grand procession. Holding flickering candles aloft, they escort the bride and groom down the cavernous stone hallways toward the royal bedchamber. This was the infamous bedding ceremony. The crowd, boisterous and laughing, physically pushes the couple over the threshold and right to the edge of the mattress. The heavy, jewel-encrusted garments are methodically removed. Then, the crowd slowly retreats. The heavy iron latch of the door clicks shut. The room appears to plunge into a peaceful silence. But if you look closely into the flickering shadows surrounding the massive canopy bed, figures remain standing, perfectly still. These are the witnesses. They were typically powerful ministers of the realm or senior ladies-in-waiting planted as spies by the monarchy. They do not hide in a distant corner. They pull up chairs right outside the bed curtains. In some regions, they stood directly at the foot of the bed. The room is dead silent, save for the heady gaze of the kingdom's elite boring into the terrified young couple. The justification for their presence was purely pragmatic. In that brutal era, a marriage certificate bearing the king's seal was not enough to secure an alliance. A political treaty was only deemed legally binding once the couple had physically consummated the union. Any delay, or any failure on the groom's part to perform his duty on that first night, was the perfect ammunition for the opposing faction to legally annul the contract. To prevent body doubles or future accusations of impotence, many royal courts demanded living, breathing witnesses right there in the room. The two youths on the bed had absolutely no choice. Under the predatory scrutiny of strangers, they had to perform the act like a mechanical test. Their awkwardness, their fear, their tears, none of it mattered. In certain courts, the witnesses would remain at their posts until they could physically inspect the bedsheets for biological proof. Only when the blood was confirmed would they nod, take the soiled linen, and march outside to announce the triumph to the anxious, waiting court. The modern concept of the sweet, romantic honeymoon did not exist. Their first night was nothing but a state-mandated ritual of alliance confirmation, a political transaction performed live for the very system that ruled them. Yet, being forced to bare oneself to strangers is only the pinnacle of psychological control. If you think that, at the very least, they got to marry a living, breathing human being, the next truth will freeze the blood in your veins. Number 9. Posthumous royal marriage, marrying the dead. A geopolitical treaty forged between two sovereign nations involves tens of thousands of mercenaries and hundreds of vital trade routes. A mechanism of that scale cannot simply be halted just because one human heart stops beating. What happens if, on the eve of the wedding, the princess or prince tragically succumbs to a sudden plague? Logic dictates the wedding would be cancelled. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, scattered folklore and fragmented historical records paint a picture of terrifying, cold-blooded pragmatism. In some regions, it was whispered that the alliance-sealing ceremonies went on anyway. In these dark, passed-down tales, a groom dressed in his finest ceremonial armor steps up to the altar. But standing opposite him is not a bride, it is merely an oil portrait of the deceased, propped up rigidly on a wooden easel. There are even darker legends suggesting that full marital rites were performed in front of a sealed wooden coffin. Regardless of the historical frequency of these morbid ceremonies, the motive was always the same: power. By completing the symbolic rituals, the surviving party hoped to legally lay claim to the promised privileges, the noble titles, or the massive dowry of the deceased's family. It was a transaction so chillingly precise that the boundary between the living and the dead was erased entirely to protect the interests of the state. This compulsion to secure the bloodline was so obsessive that the ages of the individuals forced into the next custom will leave you entirely speechless. Number 8. A 6-year-old bride, a finished ceremony waiting to come of age. We inherently associate marriage with adulthood. But in the grand courts of feudal Europe, the survival of a dynasty could not afford to wait for children to grow up. Countless treaties were signed in blood and wax when the subjects in question had just taken their first breath, or while they were still sleeping in their cradles. Open the royal archives of 1396 and gaze upon the fate of Isabella of Valois. On the day of her wedding, the girl had just turned 6 years old. At an age when normal children are merely learning to comprehend the world around them, Isabella was buried beneath layers of heavily embroidered, agonizingly heavy bridal gowns. Her innocent, bewildered face looked up at the towering altar. Standing opposite her was the groom, King Richard II of England, a fully grown man nearing his 30th birthday. Imagine the suffocating atmosphere of that cathedral. Surrounding the tiny child were dozens of stone-faced dignitaries from two warring nations, dissecting her every twitch. High clerics chanted endless vows in Latin, words a 6-year-old could not possibly comprehend. She merely mimicked the whispered commands of the nursemaid standing close behind her. Nod your head, hold out your tiny hand, and let them slide a massive, oversized ring onto your delicate finger. The documents were sealed. The legal bindings were locked into place that very day. Isabella was officially crowned the Queen Consort of England. The objective of this union was violently practical. It was the linchpin needed to secure a multi-decade ceasefire between France and England. A literal child was tossed onto the bloody chessboard of European geopolitics, acting as collateral damage for temporary peace. Naturally, because the bride was a child, the physical consummation of the marriage was suspended. After the vows, the 6-year-old queen was sent to live in a highly guarded, isolated wing. There, she was raised, molded, and indoctrinated into the laws and language of her husband's realm. This process was merely a calculated waiting game. The court was simply biding its time until she reached the age of 12 or 14, the legal age in that era when biology deemed a girl ready to share a bed with the king. Being forced to swear your life away before your mind has even formed is horrifying enough. But the next reality is even more absurd. Imagine standing before thousands of subjects, swearing eternal loyalty to a partner you have never laid eyes on, who isn't even in the same country on your wedding day. Number 7. Proxy marriage, wedded to a stranger. Imagine standing in the nave of a colossal stone cathedral, weighed down by velvet and gold, waiting for the most defining moment of your life. The royal trumpets blare. The heavy oak doors swing open. But the man walking down the crimson carpet toward you is not the young king you are betrothed to. Instead, a complete stranger, perhaps a battle-hardened general or a gray-bearded minister, slowly ascends the altar steps. Do not be alarmed, for this is the proxy marriage, a perfectly legal and incredibly common custom among the old European aristocracy. Geographical distances of thousands of miles, coupled with the mortal perils of highwaymen and diseased roads, made it far too dangerous for kings to leave their realms to fetch a bride. Their solution was entirely utilitarian: dispatch a highly trusted subordinate armed with a legally binding writ of proxy to do it for them. During the ceremony, this proxy would act out the role of the groom. He stood beside the bride, reciting the sacred vows in the king's name. He slipped the royal crest ring onto the girl's trembling finger. At the culmination of the rite, the proxy might even lean in to touch his lips to hers, or kiss her cheek, officially sealing the covenant. Once the ceremony concluded, the treaty was stamped. The marriage was legally bulletproof. The bride's identity was instantly transferred to a foreign dynasty. The very next day, she would pack her life away, board a creaking wooden galleon with her retinue, and sail across treacherous seas toward an alien land. Throughout the agonizing voyage, the only thing she had to imagine her husband by was a tiny, idealized oil portrait. This is when true, creeping terrors set in. What if the painting was a lie? What if the man waiting on the other side of the ocean possessed a monstrous temper or a twisted mind? History famously recorded the tragedy of Anne of Cleves. She underwent a proxy wedding and set sail for England to become the fourth wife of the volatile King Henry VIII. The entire foundation of their marriage was a flattering portrait painted by the royal artist. When she finally docked and stood face to face with her actual husband, both recoiled in horror, realizing the other looked absolutely nothing like what had been promised. But the trap had already snapped shut. Legally, they were bound as husband and wife before they had ever breathed the same air. There was no room for regret, and almost no turning back. We are about to enter the most brutal chapters of feudal royalty, where the sacrifices demanded shatter all bounds of modern logic. At your age, having weathered the ups and downs of life, you have likely seen modern families tear themselves apart over material greed. Looking at the forced sacrifices of the past, what are your thoughts on this agonizing trade-off? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. But for now, let us continue to see how the ancients actively drove their own bloodlines into dead ends. Marrying a phantom is a heady psychological cross to bear. You might try to rationalize it. Well, surely they have the right to speak up and refuse if they truly despise the arrangement? If you hold on to that hope, the next truth will crush it to dust. Number 6. No right to refuse, even for queens. Put yourself in the jeweled slippers of a female royal born into that era. From the moment she took her first breath, she was fed the finest meats, draped in the rarest silks, and tutored in half a dozen languages. But this immense investment was rarely born of simple parental love. It was the meticulous fattening of an asset. The vast majority of princesses had absolutely zero autonomy over their own existence. They bore one core, crushing duty to be deployed as diplomatic pawns. Look at the early life of Catherine of Aragon. While she was barely taking her first wobbly steps, her destiny was already carved in stone by the rulers of two empires. Drops of boiling wax fell onto parchment, followed by the heavy, echoing thud of the royal seal. That dry sound permanently chained her future to Arthur, a prince of England living thousands of miles away. Throughout the endless political bartering, not a single minister paused to ask what the little girl thought or felt. So, when these girls grew into women and realized the horror of their fate, could they resist? In the world of commoners, defying your parents might earn you a harsh scolding. But in the ruling class, rejecting an arranged royal marriage was tantamount to high treason. Refusing the altar meant tearing up a military alliance, blockading trade routes, or losing tens of thousands of acres of ancestral farmland. There was zero room for pity. If a princess stubbornly refused, her royal privileges were violently stripped away. In the dead of night, armed guards would drag her to an unmarked carriage. She would be banished to a remote, freezing convent, effectively erased from the dynasty's history. In more severe cases, where her defiance threatened national security, these women faced the absolute harshest punishments imaginable. The crown's vengeance was swift, absolute, and rarely allowed for exceptions. This suffocating control spared no one. And to ensure that the wealth stayed within the family, the great houses took this to horrifying extremes. Number 5. The dowry that dictated a bride's life. Do not make the mistake of thinking that royal blood alone guaranteed a woman respect when she was married off. In the cold calculus of the feudal political machine, A bride's inherent worth was measured entirely by the number of iron-bound chests filled with gold, jewels, and land deeds she brought with her. This was the dowry. When the bridal procession finally arrived at the new castle, the first order of business was rarely a warm greeting. The crown's financial ministers would march out, ledger in hand. They popped the locks on the chests, counted the gold coins, and measured the yards of silk to ensure it matched the signed treaty down to the last copper. Only if the accounts balanced was the bride truly welcomed. But what if the bride's homeland had suffered a famine or war, and the dowry fell short? That is when the true nightmare began. The bride instantly became the scapegoat for a kingdom's fury. In countless cases, the young woman was violently shoved to the fringes of the court. Her food rations were slashed, her luxurious chambers revoked, and she was banished to the damp, rotting corners of the keep. She lived a ghostly existence of isolation and mockery, practically a prisoner in her own home. Many terrified families, desperate to keep their daughters alive, would bankrupt themselves, borrowing from every lord and liquidating their lands just to scrape together enough gold to buy her safety. History even whispers of darker fates. Brides whose dowries were deemed insultingly small would suddenly fall victim to inexplicable accidents. A rapid, mysterious fever. A tragic fall during a horseback hunt. Investigations were rarely launched. Her convenient disappearance neatly cleared the path for the king to sign a new marriage treaty with a richer, more lucrative kingdom. This grinding pressure didn't end with treaties. In our next chapter, you will witness how, even after surviving the labyrinth of court politics to become queen, a woman could lose absolutely everything the moment her greatest shield vanished. Number 4. Royal widows forced to remarry instantly, denied the right to mourn. When a king drew his last breath, the tolling of the death knell echoed across the kingdom. Common decency dictates that a widow dons black mourning weeds, retreats into quiet solitude, and grieves her husband. But in the viper's nest of the royal court, time to grieve was a luxury queens could never afford. The very second the king's eyes closed, a vicious, bloodthirsty power vacuum opened. The widowed queen was no longer just a grieving wife. She was a walking, breathing vault of political leverage. She held titles, massive tracts of dower lands, and guardianship over royal-blooded heirs. The ruling elite would never allow such a monumental asset to roam free from their control. The terrifying result? Within mere months, sometimes only weeks after the funeral, many widows were forcefully dragged back to the altar. The royal council would rapidly hand-pick a new husband, usually a powerful military ally, to take over her assets. The queen was ordered to strip off her black mourning veil and force herself back into a heavily jeweled wedding gown. The scratch of a quill on parchment, and suddenly, the control over her body, her lands, and the future of her children was legally handed over to a stranger. Looking at the English court, Catherine Parr is one of the rare anomalies who managed to outmaneuver this brutal cycle. As the final wife of the terrifying King Henry VIII, she navigated a minefield of paranoia to survive until his death. But most royal widows were not afforded her cunning or luck. They were passed around from one political marriage to the next like prized maras, a relentless cycle that destroyed them physically and psychologically. And speaking of physical destruction, if we travel back to the actual days of these weddings, the sheer physical torture these women endured is almost impossible to fathom. Number 3. Weeks-long nuptials, no rest for the bride. We are accustomed to weddings being a tidy affair, A morning ceremony, an evening reception, and then you go home to rest. A medieval royal wedding never operated on such mercy. It was a massive, brutal campaign of sheer ostentation, an endurance test that could rage on for 2 to 4 uninterrupted weeks. Imagine a schedule designed to break the human spirit. Every single morning at dawn, the bride was subjected to hours of dressing. Handmaidens strapped her into agonizingly heavy gowns woven from thick, stifling woolen velvet, then pinned her with pounds of solid metal jewelry. The architectural rigidity of the corsets crushed her ribs, making a deep breath or a simple step a monumental struggle. Every day was a relentless loop, gargantuan feasts, marathon religious masses that lasted for hours, and the diplomatic exhaustion of greeting hundreds of foreign envoys. Throughout this entire ordeal, the bride was required to be on constant public display. She had to stand perfectly upright, maintain an icy, regal expression, and project absolute diplomatic perfection. The simple luxury of sitting down when her legs ached was strictly forbidden. The deafening roar of the feasting halls, the nauseating, ever-present smell of roasting meats, combined with the crushing gravity of her gown, created a hellish physical pressure. Court scribes quietly noted instances where brides were so exhausted their feet swelled to bursting, or they collapsed from sudden fever mid-banquet. Yet, no minister dared call for a halt. The political machine could not be stopped. The ailing bride was propped back up and forced to endure until the final drop of wine was poured. The agony of the crowds and the physical exhaustion were visible enemies. But there was another, far more insidious danger, something that seemed completely harmless but held the power to shatter an empire. The very clothes on her back. Number 2, strictly regulated wedding attire. The wrong color was treason. When you envision a wedding dress, the immediate image is a flowing gown of pure white. But if you dare to walk down the aisle of a medieval cathedral draped in white, you might be signing your own death warrant. In that dark epoch, a wedding dress was never an expression of personal fashion. It was a walking, breathing legal edict. Every single thread, bead, and fold was violently policed by the state. White was certainly not the standard in many kingdoms. White was the color of death and mourning. Depending on the ruling dynasty, strict sumptuary laws dictated the exact dominant color of the wedding day. It might be a deep crimson to project military dominance, a gold woven with actual metal threads to scream of infinite wealth, or a specific, heavily guarded shade of royal blue. It wasn't just the color, the specific weave of the silk, and the exact number of petticoat layers were decreed by law. Using an improper dye ratio that skewed the color, or wearing a fabric reserved for a higher rank, was not a minor faux pas. Under the predatory glare of hundreds of nobles, that slight deviation was instantly classified as an act of open rebellion. It was viewed as an insult to the crown and a terrifying omen of doom for the kingdom. The bride, the dressmakers, and anyone involved could face catastrophic charges of treason. A single, microscopic error in the dye vat could unravel a military alliance that took decades to build. Number 1, the myth that terrified all of Europe. To close out our descent into the darkness of history today, let us step outside the towering castle walls and look at the psychological shadow that paralyzed an entire continent. For centuries, a horrifying whisper drifted across the fiefdoms of Europe, a rumor that made every peasant father and husband sick to their stomachs. They called it droit du seigneur, or the right of the first night. According to the terrifying folklore, feudal lords possessed an absolute, godlike privilege, the legal right to march into the bedchamber of any newlywed serf and claim the bride's virginity on her wedding night. The sheer horror of the concept that the local tyrant could legally violate a woman's sanctity on the most sacred day of her life became a suffocating psychological plague that haunted countless territories. However, when modern historians cracked open the vaults, a different reality emerged. There is practically zero concrete legal documentation proving this atrocious custom was ever widely enforced. The vast majority of these accounts were likely dramatic exaggerations penned by later writers, or calculated propaganda designed to demonize the brutal tyranny of the Dark Ages. In reality, it was often just a heavy monetary tax that peasants were extorted into paying the lord simply for permission to marry. But the very fact that such a horrifying myth survived for hundreds of years exposes an equally dark historical truth. Just how vast was the chasm of power between the ruling elite and the voiceless masses? It was so incomprehensibly massive that the common people did not doubt it for a second. They genuinely believed that the aristocracy possessed the divine right to do whatever they wanted with their bodies and their lives. That invisible, suffocating oppression took deep root, turning a phantom rumor into a very real, paralyzing terror in the minds of an entire era. Whether myth or grim reality, all the ruthless laws and dark rumors we have uncovered today point to one terrifying conclusion. Feudal power did not merely dictate the law, it imprisoned the flesh, the blood, and the very fears of humanity. Looking back into the abyss of history, behind the blinding sparkle of the royal crown and the divine privileges of the elite, lies an agonizing price paid by the people of the past. They traded their freedom, their honor, and their very bodies for the illusion of power. Every heartbeat and every vow was controlled by the cold, dead ink of a pragmatic contract. Reflecting on these suffocating laws and the brutal sacrifices of our ancestors, what goes through your mind? How immeasurably precious is the freedom we hold in our hands today? Please leave a comment below, sharing your perspectives and thoughts with us. Thank you for walking through the shadows of history with us today. Farewell, and see you on our next journey into the dark truths of the past.